What a great panel to come off the back of, because I'm going to look at a whole range of different topics. So we're going to start at the global perspective and then fine-tune ourselves down into the Pilbara and look at how the global economy and the national economy impacts on issues in the Pilbara. So hopefully I can cover pretty much every topic under the sun because there's a lot to talk about in terms of what impacts on the Pilbara internationally and nationally. So let's see if we can cover everything from North Korea and Donald Trump all the way through to house prices in Karratha and see if we can link some of those things together. So I work for the Chamber of Commerce. We exist to help business work. We're a membership-based organisation, and a lot of this information comes from our half-yearly publication Outlook, which looks at the forecast for the WA economy. So if you'd like to read more about this, you can go and download Outlook from our website or sign up to become a member to get regular updates. But essentially, our latest Outlook, which was put out a few weeks ago, we said that we think that this is the last difficult year for the WA economy, coming off the back of 4 very difficult years, and that next year business investment will stop falling and will then begin to grow from next year on. So I'll walk you through why we think some of those things are coming true, and if you'd like to follow on Twitter, you can see the tag there. So let's start at the global level as to what impacts on the WA economy and into the Pilbara. This is a survey of the top 100 CEOs from around the world, and they asked the CEOs what is the greatest opportunity and the greatest risk to your business over the next few years. The greatest risk, it may not surprise you, is that Donald Trump triggers a trade war. Now, that is significant to us because, as I'll show you in a minute, the WA economy is very closely linked to trade. It's very closely linked to prosperity in China and Southeast Asia. So Donald Trump triggering a trade war would cause a significant downturn in our business activity here in Western Australia. Interestingly enough, the greatest opportunity, as surveyed by these CEOs, was that Trump kicks off a surge in investment and activity in the US through fiscal stimulus. So I guess for the first time we were in this strange dichotomy where Trump is simultaneously one of the greatest opportunities for business globally and also one of the greatest risks for business globally. And so we can see some of these things are we're starting to get a better sense as to how these things will play out. This survey was done straight after Trump was elected. We're now 6 months or so into that presidency, and we can see that slowly we can see that Trump is having a bit of trouble executing on his plans. So whether a trade war is going to get up or whether the fiscal stimulus that he's promised, which is $1 trillion in infrastructure in the US, which, to put that into context, is roughly all of Europe infrastructure spending in a 1 year, we're starting to realise that he's having trouble to get that through. But a significant opportunity and risk nonetheless. So what about the WA economy? What about Australia's economy, and how are we linked to the rest of the world? Well, you can see here, this is work done by the IMF globally. What moves the dial for the Australian economy? And you can see here that a 1% change in any of these economies, what does that do to WA's or to Australia's GDP? So US and the rest of the world, so Europe and the rest of the world, has a small impact, but a very significant impact from emerging Asia. And this is essentially the whole story of our economy being linked to China. And the old adage that if China sneezes, then WA catches a cold is certainly true, and now more true than ever. And it's really all about this story, and Shanghai is the great example. Now, this is the central business district of Shanghai some time ago, and if you fast forward 20 or so years, it looks something like this. And essentially, that story is built up by the Pilbara. That is Pilbara iron ore going into apartment blocks and building up the centre of Shanghai. The second tallest building in the world is there on the right. That's a mere 125 floors, which puts things into perspective of how big that city is. Now, this is really the story of what drives all of that development into cities, is this growing population in China and to a lesser extent in India, and that big bulge that's coming through in China's population. Now, there's a few troubling things that are on this slide. The first is great, which is that China's population is booming, India's population is booming, and will take over China's in the not too distant future. The second is a little bit troubling on the China side, is that you've got that enormous bulge in population around one particular age bracket. And as time goes on, the base that supports China's economy, which is the working age demographic of China, as a proportion of the total population is getting smaller and smaller. So there are less and less workers able to support the total population of China. So right now, that booming population is great because they've got tons and tons of workers driving the economy. And as their economy transitions from a business investment-driven economy and construction economy, vis-a-vis Shanghai, and more towards a service-driven economy, that population demographic change will play a big role in that. So it's going to be difficult for them to keep up with the growth that they've shown in the past, because that working base is going to get smaller as a proportion of that whole population. So let's now link that all to Western Australia and come back to the local picture. Well, in WA, it's no surprise to anyone in this room that our exports are booming and have been doing so for quite some time. We will take over the world-leading position as the major LNG exporter, overtaking Qatar in the not-too-distant future as a country, and Karratha plays a very big part in that. Now, if it wasn't for these booming exports, WA would be in a recession right now. So we're strictly, technically not in a recession, but if you were to take out exports growth from that, then we would be in a recession. And this is essentially why, because business investment in WA has dropped off a cliff. Now, if you look at that period between 1990 and 2000, let's say, there's a pretty steady trend growth there. And some of you might remember that boom around the 90s and how small that now looks in comparison to the larger picture. My previous work before the Chamber of Commerce was with Shell, and I worked around the world in the Middle East and the UK, and we would work around on these different projects, and countries would be desperate to have a single LNG train built in their backyard because of the construction and the investment that it brought, but also the massive amount of jobs that it would leave behind in those sustainment activities. Well, as you know, we've had 4 or 5 major LNG projects in WA, and that's what that looks like in terms of investment on that chart. So we can determine statistically and from a build-up of the profiles that the companies put out publicly how far up that curve we went, and that's the peak as reported by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and we can work out how far down we are. Now, we believe we're 88% of the way down that curve, or somewhere around there, and that, as I said, next year, so this year we will continue to fall, and next year we will hit that base of that peak and continue to grow from there. Time will tell, so maybe I'll come back next year and we can compare this against the actual. So the Pilbara region, well, I've got some stats on the region itself. So population growth has actually turned negative in the region in the last couple of years. Now, it's pretty rare that this happens in areas, and this is essentially driven by the resources downturn. As people lose their jobs, they move elsewhere. And so that's a troubling story because it flows through to the rest of the economy. As we know, population really drives everything around house prices, around consumption, around employment, who's spending money in the region. And so that's led to a spike and then a massive drop in prices. And so as many of you will be residents in the region, you probably can give very good anecdotal stories as to how much a beer costs and how much a coffee costs on the main strip. But that spike is much bigger than we experienced in Perth. And if you remember correctly, there was a lot of complaining about how much a coffee was in Perth. Now, to come to the more pointy issue is the median house price in the Pilbara. So as you can see here, this spiked and then dropped off a cliff very quickly after that. And in the last 3 years, the median house price in the Pilbara has dropped by 60%. And if you go back further than that, you can see it's actually fallen by much more. So up above 800,000 at its peak, and now down around 250,000 just a few short years later. So that causes very significant problems in communities. The Pilbara has one of the highest mortgage stress rates in the country, In fact, the Pilbara, I think, is 3 times higher in terms of mortgage stress rate, which is how many people are 90 days behind on their mortgage payments than the rest of the country. So that's quite concerning. But the interesting thing in the data is that unemployment seems to stay pretty steady between 2 and 3%, at least over the last few years. Now, I guess this is a story as to where the panel was getting to just before, is around how many people are you able to retain in the region when they lose their jobs? And do people come looking for work and then when they lose their job, they leave straight away? And how are you able to retain people to stick around and maybe instead of losing their job and leaving, but creating new businesses to drive future growth? So an interesting trend from that. Now, the Pilbara plays a very significant role in the Australian economy. So I can tell you that WA accounts for 40% of the nation's exports, which is an enormous amount. And when you think about how prosperity is driven in a country, it's really all around exports and value-adding things as they head overseas. The Pilbara adds 15% to the nation's exports as a whole, which is an enormous amount when you think about how much attention the Pilbara probably gets in Canberra compared to how much prosperity we actually add to the nation. It's quite significant. And that story is largely driven by minerals and resources, as you know very well, but more than half of all the mineral and petroleum resources in the state sit in the Pilbara, where the value comes from. So a lot of this will be stuff that you probably well know already, and we're now going to move into things that are looking more into the future around where we see things going at the Chamber of Commerce. So as we know, LNG has been the major growth vehicle in the region, and there's been some significant increases in investment there, and the opportunities around servicing will be huge for the LNG projects. But what about the new minerals that will be exported from the region? Well, as we know, electric vehicles are all the rage right now, and the growth trajectory for electric vehicles are enormous. Now, there's a couple of reasons why electric vehicles are now coming into the fray. The first is that there's obviously very strong links to emissions. If you can have a centralised electricity generation and then distribute that out to households where you plug in your car, you can bring down emissions essentially just due to economies of scale around your generation. But the other thing that's changed is the quality of the batteries that can go into electric vehicles. The major issue is how long can you run an electric vehicle on a single battery without having to plug it in each time. And the maximum distance for these vehicles has soared over 50, 100, 150 k's in terms of maximum distance. So what is it about lithium that makes it more attractive than other battery sources, and where is that going? Well, essentially if you compare it on a power and energy basis, and you can think of power essentially being the same as torque, and energy being the same as the volume of your gas tank, this is where lithium sits compared to its other batteries. It's sort of like thinking about a container of water. Now, the size of the container of water is the energy. How much water can you fit into that battery? And the size of the nozzle on the bottle is how much power is in there. So how quickly can you get that power out of that battery? And lithium beats other battery sources on both accounts. And this is the trajectory. This is the projection of where we need to be for vehicles to have large-scale adoption around the world. And this is the forecast for lithium, the total market value of lithium and the other components that go into lithium batteries. It's going to be an enormously large market, of which WA is already the world's leading producer for lithium, and we will play a major role in capturing that market in the future. And so much so that Malcolm Turnbull has already labelled lithium as the new iron ore for the region. So there's going to be enormous focus on that and enormous potential. So the port in Port Hedland will play a significant role. Now this is data from a ACIL Allen report which isn't published yet, but I'm lucky enough to have seen an early draft of it. And this shows the value of the port now and into the future. There's going to be a significant increase in value through that port having unconstrained export potential, and this is the value that we see going on to that. But not only does the port play a significant role in the Pilbara, but it plays a significant role in adding value and prosperity to the rest of the country. which is the story that we need to continue to tell over East. LNG trucking is going to be talked about later on today, so I won't steal the thunder, but this is interesting. This is an interesting chart that we've seen from Europe, which essentially shows the increase in shipping or trucking routes for LNG across Europe over the last few years. Now, LNG trucking is about taking LNG out of, for example, Karratha, trucking it to a mine site, and then using the LNG to offset the diesel that might be used there at the moment. We know that LNG and gas in particular is cleaner and can be cheaper, and if you can get the trucking right, it can work very well across the area. So this might be what we have in store for the Pilbara in the not too distant future. Tourism also plays a very significant part in prosperity in the region, and as the Minister said earlier, there is a significant opportunity for tourism to be the boom sector for us for the future. You can see $363 million injected into the local economy is not a small amount. The brand recognition of the Pilbara into Southeast Asia is going to be the difficult part that we have to crack, and that's what we'll be looking at soon. So I couldn't really talk about the Pilbara without talking about GST, because thanks to, I guess, everyone in this room, WA's mining royalties have been going through the roof, and that has had a very interesting impact on our GST. Now, GST was the hot topic for the weekend with Bill Shorten in town, so I thought I might give you a bit of insight into what the Chamber of Commerce is doing to advocate for a change to the GST carve-up that allows for WA to keep more of its GST back here to drive prosperity here, but we also think because it will drive prosperity around the country. So let me just first show you what the GST actually tries to do in its distribution. Well, it's carved up to account for the differences between the states. So every state government has a different level of revenue and a different level of expenses that it has to provide. So if you've got a young population, you need to have more schools. If you've got an old population, you need to have more hospitals. If you've got enormous mining revenues, then the Commonwealth Grants Commission considers you to be a wealthy state, so they think that you need less GST as a result. We think that's a problem, because if you are a wealthy state that continues to receive GST and then you're punished for developing your own economy, how about if you're a poorer state who doesn't develop their own economy but is still rewarded by the GST from other states because they haven't forged ahead like WA has? So we think that that has removed incentives for other states to develop their economies, because they'll always be propped up by the leading state, which is WA at the moment. So we think it hinders national economic growth, and there's something that should be done about it. And here we can actually demonstrate that WA loses almost all of its mining royalties thanks to the GST redistribution. So we know 90% of WA's mining royalties go to other states through the GST. So only 10% actually kept here in WA, and that makes it very difficult for the government to keep up with the infrastructure spending that, as you all know, we need to put in to support the mining regions as they develop enormous prosperity for this country. So Bill Shorten was in town yesterday. He announced $1.6 billion in infrastructure top-ups for WA. Malcolm Turnbull in the three last budgets announced a total of $1.2 billion in top-ups, which I think has gone largely unnoticed. But that's the comparison we've got right now today. It's 1.6 billion compared to 1.2 billion in the past. Now, if you equate that to what we've lost in GST redistribution since the beginning of the introduction of the GST, it looks something like this, which is 1.6 from Bill Shorten, 1.2 from Malcolm Turnbull, and 33.5 billion that we've lost since 2000. So in terms of how far do those commitments go to fixing the problem, not a great deal, not very far, but it's a very significant first step. Now, Malcolm Turnbull will be here this weekend. We're hoping for a significant long-term announcement from him that will fix the problem of the GST once and for all, so we don't have to keep going back to Canberra asking for top-ups every time this room does incredibly well in building up our resources. So that's all from me. I hope that's been useful. A look all the way down from Trump all the way down to the GST on the ground here. Thanks very much for your time.